Hi, everyone. I'm just kind of getting things set up right now, so it'll take us another minute or two before we get going. Um, so thank you for joining us. And we will be recording this, and I'll be sending out a recording afterwards. And I'm remembering how I turn off the waiting room so that I don't have to keep letting people in. Let's see.
I'm back, Emily.
All right. I'm just figuring out how I turned off the waiting room, and all of my buttons moved around because I had my screen shared. So now I'm just like, oh, where'd it go? It's been a little while since I have done this. Let's see. I think it's under host tools. There it is. The waiting room is off. All right. And I'll share my screen again. All right. Can you guys see my screen? It says enhancing soil health in high tunnels. All
Yes.
right. Excellent. So, welcome everybody to Enhancing Soil Health in High Tunnels. And in case you're wondering what today is, it's November 12th. Happy Tuesday, everyone. I'm Emily. I work at New Entry Sustainable Farming Project. I do technical assistance with farmers, so I help them with a lot of the business sides of their farms. And I'm also a flower farmer, which I'm taking a little break from flower farming right now, but I also love flower farming questions. So if you ever have any questions about flowers, feel free to send me a line. Um, so New Entry does a lot of really great work. The mission is to foster resilience in local, regional, and national food systems by training a new generation of farmers to produce food that is nutritious, culturally connected, and accessible to all individuals. We have three kind of main areas that we work in. Farmer training is what we're in tonight with workshops and webinars, and we do a farm business planning course, a crop production course, and have an incubator farm as well. We also work in food access with the New Entry Food Hub, which buys produce from our local farmers, including ones that have graduated from our farmer training programs. And then because we've been doing this for, I think, almost 25 years now, we also have a national outreach program called the Field Network. So if you are also running an incubator farm or apprenticeship program and would like to know how other people are doing it, definitely get in contact with the Field Network. If you send me an email, I can get you in contact with them. It's a really good time, and it's great to hear from other people how they are doing these things. So we're going to do some introductions and tech check. You can rename yourself and add your pronouns if you'd like by going into the participants and clicking more, as you see here. And we have people coming in from all over tonight, so I'd love if you could introduce yourself in the chat. You can just add your name, your pronouns, your farm name, and where you're located. Nice to get to know everybody. I'll put that in the chat too once I'm done with my little presentation. We are recording this. I'll be sharing the recording after the webinar. It usually takes me about a week or so to get everything kind of collected and then share out the video. And I'm trialing using an AI note taker that has been approved by Tufts University to make our lives with editing these videos afterwards a little bit easier. One of the things we're doing with this webinar project, with all the high tunnel workshops that we're doing this winter, is creating a self-paced course on growing in high tunnels and growing undercover. And going through 16 hours of webinars doesn't sound like a ton of fun for me. So I'm hoping that this makes it a little bit easier. We'll see. So thank you for letting me give that a try tonight. Uh, Please mute yourself unless you have a question. Definitely feel free to interrupt at any point. It always helps make it a little more interesting and engaging. You can put your questions in the chat as well. I don't mind interrupting Judson or anybody else who's talking, so feel free to do that, or you can raise your hand and I will let Judson know that somebody has a question. If you need the captions or transcript, click the More button on your screen and you can select either transcript or captions. At the end of this webinar, there will be a survey. It'll pop up on your screen. It's really, really helpful for us to know if people are learning things from these workshops, what else we can be doing, what other workshops you want to be taking. They're very, very quick. I make them very quick. It's like maybe 4 or 5 questions, and they are part of how we fund this workshop and the workshops in this series. It makes our grantors happy to get surveys. They just love that kind of thing. So please help us by filling them out so we can continue to do more workshops like this. Today is only the beginning of these workshops. This is our second workshop in this workshop series. We have 8 workshops total that we're hosting. The next one is going to be the finances of high tidal production. We are having these workshops the second Tuesday of every month until May, I believe. Yeah, right up here until May. So definitely come check them out. We've got some really great speakers and some really great information that we're going to share with you. And for other upcoming events, we actually have a webinar on Thursday as well about starting a value-added food business. So definitely check that out on our website, and you can join that if you'd like. We have more workshops coming up on covered production, like I was just sharing. And if you want to get more serious about your farm business, we're having a farm business planning course starting in January, which is really great and taught by the wonderful Ben Zoba. For today's workshop, we've got Judson Reid, who is the agricultural critical issue leader from Cornell Cooperative Extension, and he's going to introduce himself and tell us about him and his work, and also tell us a bunch about soil health and growing in high tunnels. That's going to be most of the night tonight. It'll probably go until about 7:30 or so, and then we'll have a Q&A at the end where you can ask more specific questions. And again, feel free to ask any questions that you have as we're going along. We're also doing a benchmarking study, and we're recruiting people to get paid to share your financial records. So we're recruiting small-scale vegetable farmers that have 2+ years of growing experience to participate in our benchmarking study. We're trying to help people improve their farm business management and record-keeping practices, compare farmers' performance against other producers at similar scales and enterprises, and develop strategies to help farmers increase their profitability. So it's pretty cool. If you're interested in getting some money to share your financial records, you can drop your email address in the chat or email, I'm not Julian, but you can email Julian at julian.barrere@tufts.edu, or you can email me as well. Then, thank you to our sponsors, our funder. It's Northeast Extension Risk Management Education from USDA. So thank you for funding this. And thanks to you guys for showing up tonight. Let's see. And if you want to turn your video on, it's nice to know that people are watching sometimes, or just kind of like there. It kind of helps us gauge like if people are interested or not. But also, if you've had a long day and you're eating your dinner, no pressure to turn it on. It is just nice to see some faces every once in a while. Let's see. And I'm just going to double check the chat to see if there's any questions. And then Judson, you can pull up your slides and we can get going.
Very good. And how am I doing, Emily? Is that coming through?
Yep, I can see it, and you've got it all on the screen. Cool.
Okay, wonderful. And if there's ever any problems with the presentation or my video or my audio, feel free to interrupt me. So thank you very much, Emily. I appreciate that. Good evening, everyone. Evening where I am. I'm honored to be here. It's great to see this participant list. People from Alaska, I think. Several people that appear to be involved in urban agriculture. I do a lot of urban agriculture work here in New York. So great to see some of my colleagues on from that side of farming, and lots of people from Massachusetts. And it looks like 3 different lettuce farmers from Trinidad and Tobago. That's pretty neat that you're joining us here this evening. And most importantly, I want to thank the new entry program at Tufts for having me here. I also am honored to share this series with some of the other people that you're going to be hearing from in the coming weeks. I know several of those presenters, and there's some good content coming your way. Hopefully this evening is also of some value to you. Emily and I did talk about it, and you're welcome to interrupt me at any point if anything's not clear. I'd rather you did that than be left wondering what I meant by something. So a little bit about me. I do work for Cornell University. We're agricultural university here in New York State, and I conduct research and education in a number of different subsectors of agriculture, but in particular, I do work in soil health in protected settings, what we call high tunnels. High tunnels really are greenhouses. They're soil-based greenhouses, and so that soil health is really essential to crop health. And of course, then crop health is meeting our other objectives, whether that's profitability on the farm or food sovereignty or nutrition, et cetera. And so as an introduction, soil health, I like to break it into 3 dimensions. Those are chemical, oftentimes thought of as nutrients; physical, so the porosity of the soil. How well can that soil physically permit root growth? And then biological, what's the biological community look like, and how well is it functioning to provide nutrients to our crops or facilitate the movement of nutrients to our crops? So let's see here, moving forward. So let's talk about these greenhouses again that I call we call high tunnels. I like to remind everyone they are indeed greenhouses. What makes them a high tunnel is the fact that we're using the soil. And so I'm just going to quickly level set in terms of why we might choose to grow fruits and vegetables or flowers, in Emily's case, indoors. In this case, we have a pepper crop, and we grow these indoors because we get not really necessarily a higher yield, but we get a better quality yield, particularly if we're trying to grow for color. We get a higher percentage of our crop harvested for color versus losses that we have in the field to rain and insects possibly. But I remind people that a high tunnel or a greenhouse really should be considered in a vertical format, in a vertical fashion. And so here we have greenhouse cucumbers being trellised vertically. And you can imagine if I had this same cucumber crop outside to achieve that level of canopy, I would probably need about 3 times the footprint. So these greenhouses or high tunnels are great for maximizing canopy yield, profitability, where we have limited space. So for my friends that are working in urban environments, particularly of value. For people that are in colder climates, also of particular value. For our friends that are growing in the tropics, these also can play an important role in allowing the production of these vegetables, fruits and vegetables, during rainy months where we wouldn't be able to grow them outside, or we would have a considerable amount of crop disease outside. Most of my work is with vegetables, but I do want to highlight that these structures have tremendous potential for other crops too. Here we have black raspberries, not blackberries, but black raspberries that are being grown indoors. And by growing these indoors, we keep rain off of the fruit. And now the shelf life of this product is much, much greater than it would be if it was grown outdoors. If it's grown outdoors, very susceptible to rain. And then we get these different molds on the berries and they melt down in a hurry. There's very little post-harvest longevity to that crop. When it's grown inside, all of a sudden now we have more marketing possibilities because this crop will hold up longer once it's harvested. For those of us who do live in the north, the use of a greenhouse or high tunnel can let us grow a crop that we wouldn't be able to otherwise. And I bet you many of you recognize this crop here just left of the center as ginger. Ginger for the United States is grown primarily in Hawaii. So to grow this in our cold, cool climate of the Northeast, the greenhouse is really essential. This is what that ginger looks like when we dig it up from the soil. Just a real treat to be able to grow these tropical species. And the high tunnel allows us to do that. But most often, we think about these structures for season extension. In the case of these warm-loving crops, I like to call that season acceleration. I call it acceleration because what we're doing with the plastic and steel is capturing more heat units, what we call growing degree days, and the crop accumulates those. And so that's season acceleration in the case of this ginger or cucumber or pepper crop. In the case of our cool weather crops, in this case, lettuce, we have true season extension. And this is a lettuce crop that an organic CSA grower has put out there with the intention of having harvest at the end of December. And so this allows us to truly extend the season into, in our case, November and December, where we might have snow, obviously a lot of rain, and frost that would damage this crop outside. So now I'm going to share a video of the important use of row cover or low tunnels inside of high tunnels. All right. So I recognize probably a lot of you are looking at that soil and thinking, wow, that's a lot of rocks. It is. It's a very stony, gravelly
I was just
soil.
thinking that same thing. Those are a lot of rocks.
It
They are
really, it
big
really
rocks
is.
too.
I know. I feel like they should be running a gravel pit. Uh, this is in the Catskill Mountains of New York State, so not the most fertile soil, very stony. What I'm trying to illustrate with this video is the covering and uncovering of this crop indoors is essential to that season extension. And so you saw the workers there bringing together these blanket like row covers at the beginning of the day. And the concept is the sun shines and is charging the soil. And then at night, we want to cover this crop with those row covers to trap what we call infrared wavelengths, which is how heat escapes out of a greenhouse. And a greenhouse is a horribly energy inefficient structure. It moves heat very, very readily.
There's
So
a question
that,
in the chat.
yes, go for it.
Um, can you put a hoop house inside the high tunnel?
A hoop house, like say perhaps maybe like low tunnels, that sort of thing, Emily?
It's yes, they are saying yes.
Yeah, that absolutely. And so in this case, you could see that that was laid flat over top of the crop. Certain crops, taller ones, I'm thinking of like a taller, what we call Swiss chard, or different Asian greens, we will put in low hoops and then a tunnel over top of that. But the important thing is to be able to cover and uncover that on a daily basis. So we want to cover it at night to reduce the movement of infrared wavelengths out, and then remove it in the morning so that we can charge the soil and the crop canopy with solar radiation, with heat. And in this case, those stones actually hold on to a lot of heat. And this is the secret really to growing in the winter time. Very, very important is the use of those low tunnels. These are just some
Maybe you're
still
thinking of the
photos.
rocks as like a heat sink also. Um,
Absolutely.
there's there's another question in the chat from LaShawn with Finding Justice Garden in Chicago. How do you get away with growing in the ground? Their soil is contaminated with lead. Do you have to remediate the soil first?
Big up to my friends in Chicago. Great question. In New York, we also have a lot of lead contamination and other metals. And standard practice here is one, test for those metals. So find a lab that can test for those. Number two is we use raised beds. And so generally we're trying to cover the contaminated soil with some type of barrier. Ground cloth is fine, and then build above that with a mixture of clean soil, compost, and maybe some other amendments as well. So common problem both in New York and Chicago, and we like to grow in clean soil.
So the follow-up to that is, so this hoop house is over a raised bed. Are the soils at this greenhouse contaminated, or is this a greenhouse where there is, or a high tunnel where there has not been leads found in the soil?
It's the latter. So the ones in these pictures are in rural settings. Not that rural settings are, immune to contamination, but much less so. And so these are grown in the native soil. I could share, I don't have them in this slide deck, but we have several farms that you can look up online in New York. One is called Red Hook Farm in Brooklyn that uses a high tunnel, and it's 100% compost based. And so that's built up on an old parking lot. But there's about 2 feet of compost that the crops grow in. So that, yeah, and that includes the high tunnel as well.
When they got that soil and compost added in, how did you know how they funded that? If they got like grants or if they found a compost company that was able to donate to them?
Well, that's a good question. So New York City, we had a great municipal composting project where organic waste was being collected and then composted at multiple municipal facilities, some of them quite large on Staten Island. And then that was available for free for community gardens and urban farms. During the COVID pandemic, then that program unfortunately was discontinued. It was a part of the sanitation budget. So we've lost out on that right now. That might be more detailed than what you wanted. But this is my own personal position. I'm very much in favor of municipal composting because to do this at this level, you need a volume of compost. Now, I'm not an advocate for 100% compost as a growing medium. Now, I'll talk about that why in a little bit. But for contaminated sites or urban sites, it is a viable alternative. The challenge is to get enough volume, and in the absence of a municipal or state-run program, that's a challenge, and it's quite expensive. I'm loving these questions. Thank you so much. Keep them coming. For my friends in Alaska, I just wanted to share this is a greenhouse in probably a zone 4A in New York State, so in close to the Adirondack Mountains. Quite cold area. This is January, and this is first thing in the morning. You can see here now those low tunnels that I think someone else was asking about before. Now this is just a half an hour later after the sun is up. you can see the row cover is brought into the row middles, and then the crop is open to sunlight. This is important for a lot of reasons. I already made my point on heat. So we're charging the soil and the crop with heat, but we also need that light. Remember, light is really the magic ingredient for plants to do what they do. And at our latitude, we need as much light as possible. And so it's really important to remove those covers so that we can get some sunlight into the crop, and in particular to keep it dry so that we stay away from disease issues. And I do see that you have a disease session coming up here in a few weeks. So this is, again, the secret to true season extension inside of a high tunnel really does involve row covers. Now, I mentioned that this is in a cold mountainous region and it's to make the point that you can do this without supplemental heat. There's no supplemental heat in this structure, and I took this photo, I'm pretty sure it was the 3rd week of January. So at this point, we have several feet of snow on the ground outside, and our nighttime temperatures are going to be below freezing every night. And this is, again, done without supplemental heat. If people want to know more about greens, I'm happy to do that, maybe in a question and answer form. But the secret here is getting this crop in the ground early enough so it's established coming into the cold, dark months of winter. And so oftentimes that means transplanting our vegetables, probably for us, no later than October 1st. Excuse me.
Looks like there's like no weeds in there.
Yeah.
Do you know if they're doing no-till or are they just like really on top of their weeding game?
It is this does get tunneled. Great question, Emily. Thank you. And credit goes to the farmers, Paul and Sandy Arnold at Pleasant Valley Farm, who are very generous with their production knowledge. They are using here degradable mulch film with straw in between the rows, and then they would hand weed this additionally on for these larger crops. You can see to the right, there's probably some more direct seeded, and that is all hand weeded.
With the
But
biodegradable mulch, does that change the soil chemistry at all? Does it like raise any pH or add anything else into the soil that you have to be careful of?
great question. I'll give you the manufacturer's response, which is it only adds carbon and water. So these films have advanced considerably over the last couple decades. And so some of them are photodegradable. In other words, they degrade in light, and others are biodegradable. And generally it's the most popular brands that I see are made from cornstarch. So really it's starch that is degrading into the soil, and as far as we know is not affecting it at the moment.
All right. There's another question in the chat, and somebody is wondering how they are watering these greens.
Boy, these are great questions. I love this engagement. So there is drip irrigation available here. And you'll also see, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but there's a yellow upright here in the mid upper right for overhead watering. So this depends a little bit on what you're growing. If you're growing a direct seeded crop, in other words, you're putting a seed into this soil itself, and then you expect that to germinate and produce this, you're going to probably need overhead watering in order to germinate it and have emergence. If you're transplanting, which sounds labor intensive because it is labor intensive, but if you're transplanting, then the better option is to run drip tape between each row of, say, in this case, in the center, I think that's kale. And having that drip irrigation is preferable to overhead because, again, in the shorter days of wintertime, if that foliage is wet, particularly overnight, we are setting ourselves up for the common diseases that we see indoors, gray mold in particular, which then we lose the crop. So I would prefer drip irrigation in this setting.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. And this is a slide I've borrowed from My friends Paul and Sandy. Paul's here in blue. And these high tunnels are about a tenth of an acre, if you're familiar with those units. Um, so around, say, 4,400 square feet. And here, Paul and Sandy are sharing some of their highs and lows of winter market sales out of these per tunnel. And so you can see from November to June 1st, these are grossing for the total revenue of around $1,700. This slide is a couple of years old. I think you could probably adjust that up closer to $2,000. But I want to make a point here, which is that look at those dates, November 12th to June 1st. So that means that a crop probably went in the ground here no later than October 1st, more likely mid-September. And then we're taking those crops, all these different green crops, chard, kale, arugula, all of the different Asian greens, lettuce. We're taking those all the way up until June. So if you want to achieve this level of revenue from this space from greens crops or winter crops, you're going to be tying up that space all the way till June. Then, if you want to, you can jam in a warm season crop, even though it feels a little bit late. But here, this is a focus on winter production, and that's what really allows that figure to be so high. This is an important argument in favor of the use of transplants. So let's say that we did have a tomato or a cucumber crop in this space on June 2nd. We had a very efficient turnaround, and I was able to transplant in a 6 to 8 week old fruiting vegetable in that space. And I took it from June through July, June, July, August, September, and then I'm about done. So I've got about 4 months there to harvest a warm season crop. The other 8 months are going to be dedicated to a cool season crop. Transplants allow you to have that quick turnaround. Whereas if you direct seed, you're losing at least 4 weeks of production time. So a strong encouragement to maximize the value of the space, use transplants. So I've talked about everything but tomatoes, and that was on purpose. Tomatoes truly are the king of these spaces, and they are globally, not just here where I work in New York, but globally as well. Any greenhouse crop, the most common greenhouse crop is tomatoes. There's several reasons. One is that tomatoes respond by increasing their yield and their quality. Tomatoes are a very disease susceptible crop. We've got early blight, bacterial spot, late blight, bacterial speck. I could go on and on and on. And so many of those diseases come from leaf moisture. And so by keeping the canopy dry, we can eliminate the need for fungicides, organic or conventional. They're also able to take advantage of that vertical space, like I mentioned earlier with cucumbers. And tomatoes are sold by weight. And ask yourself, well, what is a tomato made of? It's over 90% water. So when you're selling a product by weight versus volume, it helps to have a heavy fruiting vegetable like this, like tomatoes. Peppers, on the other hand, generally are sold by volume, and a pepper is largely air. So with peppers, a lot of times you're selling air, and with tomatoes, you're selling water.
So
Tomatoes tend to have a, go ahead, Emily.
um, tomatoes being mostly water and being inside, you're on like a pretty regular watering schedule, or say you're trying to like add more water in to like increase the weight of your tomatoes. Are you finding that in tunnels you're getting more calcium deficiency problems in tomatoes? Or like if you keep growing tomatoes in the same high tunnel year after year, and then you're getting more blossom end rot because of that? Or are there any other like soil considerations that you should think about with the tomatoes?
Absolutely. And that's the remainder of my presentation. So it's a good question.
Okay.
But 100%, I should put that out there now. It's a very good question. This requires daily watering, and we're using drip irrigation in case that's not clear yet. You can see we also have black plastic mulch on the rows here. And then we have straw mulch in between the rows, and that helps us retain some moisture, keep any weeds down, and also reducing dust. And that's really a pest management issue. If we can reduce dust, we reduce our spider mites and thrips population a lot. So we really like that straw mulch for reducing.
And there's another quick
dust.
question.
Yep.
How are the tomatoes pollinated indoors?
Great question. So we prefer the use of bumblebees. So we buy commercial hives of bumblebees. They come in little cardboard boxes. And we set those up inside the greenhouse, and they do an outstanding job. There are other people that will use what we call a mist blower or leaf blower, which is a kind of a reverse vacuum. You can wear it as a backpack, and it just shakes the flowers. Tomatoes are not hard to pollinate, particularly in a field. A light breeze, other insects, handling by humans will all help pollinate tomatoes. But indoors, we have less natural pollinators. We have less wind. And in the springtime, we may not be handling the tomatoes very much. So a commercial hive of honeybees is really the way to go. And this isn't an endorsement of any company, but there are two large companies that supply North America with honeybees. Those would be Koppert, 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 and BioBest, BioBest. And those would be great places to start shopping if you're growing tomatoes indoors to get those bumblebees. We don't like honeybees indoors. They don't respond well to the enclosed setting or the plastic, whereas bumblebees work quite well for us.
Then there's another question in the
ahead.
chat, which you might have. So it is, can they also get pollinated naturally if the tunnel sides are left open?
Yes, great question. So if the sides are open and you have a breeze, and you will have naturally occurring pollinators, including bumblebees, come in and pollinate that way. And there are many people that's all they do. They'll roll up the sides and let really nature take over the pollination. And it does seem to work just fine. Where I see the benefit of bumblebees is when you're growing in the first few months, you might have some flower sets, say in April, maybe March, April, and you're not rolling up the sides because it's still too cool outside. There are no pollinators flying yet to speak of. And so really it's for that first couple clusters that bumblebees are really important. And not only will you have more flowers pollinated, so a higher fruit set, but you'll have larger fruit too. That's our experience, is that we get larger fruit due to a more complete pollination that the bumblebee does. They're really fun to watch and great to include in high tunnel production. I do want to caution you, if you're growing greenhouse cucumbers, you don't want those pollinated. So please don't buy bees if you're growing greenhouse cucumbers. Those are generally self-fertile, and pollination will distort your fruit. So this is for tomatoes.
And there's a couple more questions about watering, but are you going into watering in one of your next slides, or do you want me to give you the watering questions now?
Why don't I hear them, Emily? So then I can choose if I hit them now or later.
So the first question is, are you doing everyday watering? How long? And are you using moisture meters? And then the second question is there a significant difference between daily waterings versus a few times a week?
Great questions. And I was kind of getting to this when I was talking about all the different mulch. So underneath the black plastic here is either one or two what we call drip tapes or trickle irrigation. And we are watering every day in this setting. And I would rather maintain a very steady state of moisture versus up and down of, say, 2 to 3 times a week. Now, when your plants are small and maybe the sun isn't shining as much and temperatures are a little cooler, it's going to be less. Maybe it will be 2 or 3 times a week. But for a crop this size, absolutely, it's every day. And I'll share this site in particular. We were hitting around 3/4 of a gallon of water per plant per day, or about, for our metric friends, somewhere around 3 liters of water per plant per day. Now, this is a soil-based system. If I was in containers, that would be much higher. And this is a well-drained soil. So if I had a heavy soil with higher clay fraction, it would probably be less. But I think almost any greenhouse that has this level of canopy, you're going to be watering every single day. And that's real important for maintaining calcium, which Emily brought up a few minutes ago. That water is essential for calcium transport out to the fruit. All right, we'll keep moving. So I'm supposed to be talking about enhancing soil health. Hopefully by now I've encouraged you a little bit and got you thinking about what you could grow, what makes sense for you. But again, maintaining that soil is absolutely essential. So soils in these situations need additional love or management than outdoor soils. And that's because we don't have any precipitation moving through the soil profile. And we're using all that water that I just mentioned, hundreds and hundreds of gallons of water per day. And we're also cropping it very intensively. If you think back to the slide about having greens in there from October until June, and then tomatoes from June until September, that's a very demanding crop cycle for the soil. So this is why I like to say that high tunnel soils need additional attention. If we can grow cover crops between our vegetable crops, we have a great opportunity to scavenge and fix nitrogen and improve our soil health. We like to use row covers and choose a seeding date to maximize the biomass of our cover crop and the amount of nitrogen that we can get out of that cover crop.
So you're using row cover on your cover crops?
We do. Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, I like it though.
Thank you. It may have been one of my only original ideas, but we originally had this idea, if we're going to grow cover crops, could we heat them? And that may be fun to do someday, but it hit me that we have all this row cover laying around, and the people who are growing greens use row cover. Why don't we use row cover on our cover crop too? Species,
How much?
Go ahead, Emily.
How much do you feel like using the row cover increased the biomass that you were making in the tunnels?
Great question. It increased it significantly. I think this slide deck might have a chart that shows you how much, but enough to do it. So in some cases, it may be the addition of, I would say, dozens of pounds on a per acre basis of nitrogen. And one of the points I'm moving towards here is that if we can grow our own nutrients, we're saving money and we're improving soil health, particularly around a crop like a nutrient like nitrogen, which is increasingly expensive. Growing a cover crop doesn't get us away from all of our challenges. The cover crop would have to take the place of those winter greens. And then you take a revenue loss, of course. We may be increasing some pests. We'll talk about that. And it does require additional tillage. And someone asked earlier, are we using raised beds? Is this a no-till, et cetera? This system, unfortunately, is still fairly tillage intensive. In other words, we're working that soil, which impairs the physical dynamic and biological dynamic. of our soil. And so we're looking forward to coming up with additional solutions to reduce that tillage. So let's talk about tomatoes. This is what we want to see. A very heavy fruit load, large. This is pollinated by bumblebees. But more often than not, what I do see are these sorts of problems where this fruit has a disorder that we call yellow shoulders. And unfortunately, it's going to have a green or yellow core that comes into the center of the fruit like that. And I'll also point out, if you look at this cluster, we probably have, well, we have two different clusters there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I can see 8 tomato fruit in that image. Whereas here I only see 2. And what happens is, if we're not managing our nutrients well, the plant will naturally drop flowers to accommodate for the amount of nutrients it has access to. And this yellow shoulders that I see here on the tomato fruit is also an indication that I'm struggling with some nutrient uptake, specifically in this case, potassium. Emily asked a question earlier about blossom end rot or calcium deficiency. And that's what we can see here on this tomato fruit. This dark spot that's on the side. Most often, blossom end rot is down on the bottom of the fruit. And what it is, again, is that calcium deficiency. And calcium depends on water to be transported to the far end of the fruit. And when it's not there, you're just not going to have, those cells aren't going to fill out the fruit. And you'll have a dry rot or bottom rot on that fruit. Early in the season, oftentimes it comes up along the side, and we call this internal blossom end rot. And there may be all the calcium we ever wanted in the soil here, but there's some other things that are restricting its uptake. Water is one of them, or excess nitrogen could be another one. So many, if not all of you, are farmers or growers of some type. And farmers all over the world, when they see a nutrient deficiency, like I just shared with you in those last 2 slides, what do? Naturally, they apply fertilizers because they want to overcome whatever that nutrient deficiency is. And unfortunately, this is a common scene in my work, is to see all of these fertilizer bags. So let's count them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So that's 11 bags of fertilizer. And you can see my scientific measurement tool here, a soup spoon, to measure those out. I'm here to tell you, whatever your crop is, you don't need 11 bags of fertilizer. Conventional, organic, somewhere in between, you do not need 11 bags of fertilizer. This is a little bit better situation that the farmer has cleaned things up, so there's less of a tripping hazard. But again, I want to point out now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different products. And these are being injected here through a water-driven injector or proportioner. And we'll go through some data here that hopefully is going to help you get down to using just a couple of different fertilizer sources for what you're growing. In order to determine what we need to apply, the most important thing we can do is take a soil test. And so you'll see here a soil probe, and you'll see a plastic bag for collecting that soil. I often ask groups of farmers, what's the most important piece of tool on your farm? And I get all kinds of answers. Some will say the greenhouse itself. Others have a favorite tractor that they love. I would suggest that the most important tool or set of tools on your farm are, first and foremost, a pencil and a pad of paper. Your own ability to manage the resources that you're fortunate enough to have at your hands comes down to that. Pen and a pencil. a pencil and a pad of paper to make informed decisions. After that, I would say the soil probe is the next most important tool on your farm. The reason I say that is the health of the soil is really the foundation for your success as a farmer. And if you don't take a soil test, you don't know what's going on within that foundation. So among the non-human resources on your farm, my argument is soil is the number one resource. And taking a soil test annually for high tunnel or greenhouse production is essential.
Do you have any favorite places that you like to get your soil tested? Um, I always tell people to go to UMass Amherst Extension for soil testing. Are there other ones that you know of that you like?
Yeah, so here in New York, we have a lab called Agro One, AGRO one, Agro One. Sometimes it's called Dairy One as well, because we're a big dairy state. But Agro One is my preferred lab for taking soil samples. And I think you're right, Emily. If you're in the States and you can, working with your land grant soil labs is probably the best way to go. So I think you're on track there, Emily, by saying UMass. For private labs, I have had a great relationship with a lab called Waters, Waters, Waters Ag Lab. And they have labs now, I think, in 3 southern states. And they're a great group of people to work with and very, very affordable. And we should talk about the price of these things. Generally, you're looking at something of less than $20. And if we look at the total revenue potential of these spaces, it's clear to me that that's $20 well spent. And take a quick look at my time here. Okay. So now you've taken that soil sample, and before I go further, I should mention it's good to take a representative sample. And so in a single bay greenhouse, say 3,000 square feet, I might take somewhere between 6 to 8 cores with this soil probe, put them into this bag, and then mix it up. So I have a representative sample, not just one spot. Now that's assuming that you have fairly uniform conditions inside. If you have a known problem spot, crop there is always smaller, always kind of yellow, sample that separately to help you understand what's going on there. And here I have a fancy soil probe. You don't have to have that. You can use a shovel, you can use a garden trowel, you can use anything that's going to get you into really the rooting zone of your crop. And for most vegetable crops, that's really no more than 8 inches. If you can pull a soil sample from the top 4 to 8 inches, that's just fine. If you are going to use your own shovel, it should be clean before you take the soil sample so you're not contaminating it, say, with field soil or rust or something like that that's going to interfere with your readings. So having taken that sample, I'm going to get results back, hopefully sometimes as quick as a week. And the real challenge begins now, which is to apply our management skills to those results. So I'm going to point out some values on these results, and we'll talk our way through how do we respond to these. So phosphorus here is reported in pounds per acre. Many labs will report in parts per million, and that's fine too. For these nutrients up here, generally the relationship between pounds per acre and parts per million is 2 to 1. But in this case, it's pounds per acre, and that's what I'm most comfortable with. And you can see my value here is 129, and the lab is telling me that's very high. My potassium is 114 pounds per acre, and I'm borderline low. Calcium is about 8,000 pounds per acre, listed as very high, and magnesium is very high at around 400 pounds per acre. A couple other important values here. Soil pH is 7.4. I would rather see that down around 6.4. So I know I've got a problem here. iron, manganese, zinc, and aluminum. These are all metals. They're essential plant nutrients. They're not they're not toxins in and of themselves, but we do want to keep an eye on these values and make sure they're not high either. These values are all acceptable. And then soluble salts, measured in what they call millimoles per centimeter. Don't worry about that unit, but I would encourage you to think about this concept. In soil-based greenhouses, our soil salt levels are prone to elevate over time because we have no rain, we have no snow. We're adding water, we're adding fertilizers, and both of those contain salts. And over time, those levels can increase and then begin to damage our roots. So part of enhancing soil health in high tunnels is taking an annual salt test. Most labs will not do this unless you ask them to. In my case, it's a $5 test. So for $5 additional, I can get this very valuable figure here, which is my soluble salts. In this case, if that figure is above 2.0, I'm going to see some major issues around germination. So again, include a soluble salts test every time you do a soil test indoors. And then finally, this percent OM, that stands for organic matter. And the value here is 3.6. That means that 3.6% of my soil is in organic matter. Organic matter is essential, and we'll talk about why, but there is such a thing as too much.
Quick question.
Go ahead, Emily.
With these soluble salts and the salt levels, uh, I've had people ask me before if salt marsh hay is an issue because of the salt levels. And personally, when I've used salt marsh, I've always been fine. It's worked out fine for me. But I also never paid that close of attention to the soil test results. Usually I have somebody else look at that stuff. So if somebody is using like seaweed or salt marsh hay, should they not do that in a high tunnel if rain's not gonna make these salts go away? Yeah.
And I know less about salt marsh than I do about seaweed, and I don't know much about seaweed. But seaweed is a major salt concern because it's coming from salt water, and it's completely saturated with that water even when it's dry, and all of those salts remain there. So it is a concern. Salt marsh hay. So is that grass that's harvested from a salt marsh?
Uh, yes.
Okay.
It's a hay that's harvested from a salt marsh. I believe it's a specific variety of grass, uh, and not just like grass that is in a salt marsh. It's like the variety of grass that grows in salt marshes.
I got you. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
It if that is the above ground portion of it, I would be surprised if it would be a concern because the plant isn't going to accumulate salts, right? The above ground portion of a plant doesn't really accumulate salts. It's the below ground concern of salt intolerant plants. Those roots are severely impacted by salts there. I do see elevated levels of sodium sometimes in elevated salt situations. So I would probably want that tested as well. And really that's my message here this evening is for people to make information-based decisions and around your water, around your soil, around your inputs, including salt marsh hay or any compost. All of those things should be tested and analyzed so you know what you're working with. And so I would test that and see what are my salt levels. And real quickly, salts are not just sodium. There's other types of salts as well, calcium bicarbonates and magnesium chlorides, etc. Sodium chloride is the one we think of the most, but there's other forms of salt as well. So have those inputs tested.
There's a comment from City Green. Sorry, I forget what your name was. That salt hay is a New Jersey specialty and it grows in the meadowlands, and the hay does not contain any salt, so it is fine to mulch with.
Right on. I appreciate that.
And then there is a question from Renee. They would like to hear your thoughts on ideal SOM. They're setting up They are up to 6.9% in the field, not in a tunnel.
Great. Okay. So ideal organic matter. Great question. And I was trying to get out of addressing that topic, but let's do it. I was going to address it, but the question of what's ideal. And my response is there is no such thing as ideal. And the reason being that the mineral fraction of the soil is very important in relationship to the percent organic matter. So real quick, we can all probably conceive of organic matter is generally the decayed product of vegetative material, right? Over time, microbes are breaking down organic matter or breaking down plant material generally into what we call organic matter. And that organic matter is essential for holding on to nutrients, for aggregating our soil. So in other words, creating porosity through aggregates that plant roots can grow around in times, and they can have dry conditions if they need them, or they can tap into those aggregates if they need to access moisture. And organic matter does that as well as supporting our microbial life. So it improves our physical dimensions of soil health, it improves our microbial dimensions, and organic matter also contributes to our nutrient status of soil health over time, as well as it's able to liberate nitrogen over the long term. But there is such a thing as too much of a good thing. I know it's hard to believe, but I've found that to be true. And when your organic matter level is too high, generally you're going to have an imbalance in other dimensions, particularly nutrients, particularly calcium and magnesium are going to become so elevated in pursuit of that very high organic matter that now the calcium's so high that it's restricting the uptake of other plant nutrients, and your pH also becomes very high. The other reason I can't give you an ideal figure is that percent organic matter is going to vary again by the mineral fraction of the soil. So in a sandy soil, an organic matter of 3.6% would actually be quite good, because sand is a coarser, larger particle than silt or clay. And so what that means is that it moves a lot more water, it has a lot more pore space, and less surface area. And it burns through organic matter much quicker versus a finer mineral fraction, silt and clay. We can see organic matters that might be 6-8% in a very healthy soil. So a lot of this depends on what is your soil type, what we call soil type. And all of us have soil types, from Alaska to Trinidad. Every one of us has a different soil type. I would encourage you to figure out what is your soil type in regards to sand, silt, clay, and loam. And then begin to think about what is a realistic organic matter to achieve. For some people, it might be 4%. For other people, it might be 8%. I generally don't see a value in going above 8%, though. I'll share that.
There's a few more questions.
Sure.
All right. So the first one, why are high salt levels bad?
Boy, that's a good question. Why are high salt levels bad? So high salt levels will injure plant roots. And so they'll create lesions on plant roots, and they will prevent the development of finer hair roots. And most of our nutrient uptake actually occurs at that interface of the very fine hair roots or smaller secondary roots and the soil. And so you simply have less nutrient uptake where your salts are high, because that high salt concentration is inhibiting the growth of roots. That's the best I think I can answer that right now as to why they're bad. When we do then create those injuries, you get diseases coming in on those injuries into the roots and just less nutrient uptake.
Do you have
There's
any recommendations for best practices for removing excess salts from high tunnel soils?
absolutely, I think the best thing to do is create a leaching event if you can. And what I mean by a leaching event is moving enough water through that soil profile to pull those salts out. Now the question is, how much is enough water? So in the Western US, where they have naturally sodic or saline soils, there's research that shows it takes around 30 inches of rain to reset those soils to a salt level that's acceptable for most annual crops. If you live in the Northeast US, Emily's in Massachusetts, I'm in New York, we generally get about 30 inches of rain a year. Could be 28, could be 35. So in a field setting, this is a secret, one of the secrets to our productive soils is that we have a lot of rain that keeps our soils healthy. In a high tunnel, we don't have any. So we have to create those leaching events. And there's a couple ways to do that. The easiest and best way to do this in my mind is to change the plastic covering on your high tunnel at the end of the manufacturer's recommended usable life of that plastic, which is generally around 3 years. Now, when I say 3, most farmers hear the word 5. So that means they're probably changing them out on a 5-year basis. Be great if you could do it on a 3-year basis. So what I would recommend is in the fall of that 3rd year of the last year of the usable life of that plastic, remove it. So then at least you have 1 winter's worth of precipitation moving through the soil profile. Now, if we get 30 inches of rain in a year, let's say we get half of it in the wintertime, that gives you 15 inches of rain moving through that soil profile. If you were to do that every 3 years, I believe that your salts are going to be okay. Now, if you can't do that, you need to create your own leaching event with a flooding of that soil. And now the question is, does your water source support that high of an application of water through the soil? I don't think you're going to get 15 inches on in one event. You'll have a swimming pool. But can you move 2, 3, 4 inches of rain or of irrigation water through that soil? Will your water source support that? Do you have a well? Are you on municipal water? Do you have a stream, a pond? Those are all things to think about. So
All right,
while we're
so
talking, go ahead, Emily.
there's a few more questions. You want to do a little talking before I ask you the questions, or you want me to shoot them away?
Why don't you ask the questions, because I'd rather answer questions than just plow through a presentation.
Okay, sounds good. So there is a question about why there's no nitrogen data on the slides,
Yeah.
and uh, asking about boron, and then another comment and another question that soil tests don't often show nitrogen levels since nitrogen levels fluctuate so much, and then someone asking for advice on how to monitor nitrogen availability in tunnels. So nitrogen
Well,
questions.
yeah, and these are all great questions. I give credit to all of you for being engaged and asking these excellent questions. So it sounds like one person answered it, which is that nitrogen is generally not on a soil test for a couple of reasons. One is that the assumption is it's a blank slate every year. In other words, every year you're starting from 0. That's not true, but that's the working assumption, that you're starting from 0 ppm and 0 pounds of nitrogen per acre per basis. And so most of the recommendations that you get on nitrogen are starting from 0. And so for tomatoes in a high tunnel, we might say you need 100 to 150 pounds of nitrogen per acre per year. Again, assuming that you have 0. So why do we assume that you have 0? We assume that because nitrogen is a very ephemeral nutrient. It volatilizes up into the air very readily, and it leaches down into the soil very readily as well. So in field production, this is it's a very working truth. there is nitrogen available in any soil. But for commercial farming, it makes sense to assume that we're going to build a budget on a year-by-year basis. Now, let's go back to organic matter. The higher that organic matter, the more nitrogen that we have banked in the soil that soil microbes, if they're there, can liberate for us over time. And so one person I recall suggested that for every percent organic matter they have, they would count that as 10 pounds of nitrogen. Now, that's a little bit hard to predict because the nitrogen that is in the organic matter is in a background form, an amino form, and it requires the soil microbes to what we call mineralize it into a nitrate form that then is readily taken up by the plant. So now the question is, when are the microbes going to do that? And that depends on presence and functionality of the microbes there, temperature, soil temperature, and moisture. And so particularly in our high organic matter soils, again, for my urban friends that are more compost-based, we can see very heavy flushes of nitrogen when we get into late spring, early summer, when that soil temperature may get up around 80 degrees and the moisture is there, and oof, a lot of nitrogen is released, and we'll have a lot of quick vegetative growth in those settings. So if we were to build out this soil test even further, we could add what we call a pre-sidedress nitrogen test. Now, pre-sidedress is a term that comes to us from our friends in the world of corn, growing field corn, where they side dress nitrogen. But we still use that term, PSNT. And what that will do is give us a parts per million of nitrogen in the soil. It's another quick, cheap test, but you need to add it on. The lab will not do it unless you tell them to. But you could ask for, again, a pre-sidedress nitrogen test, or simply called sometimes a nitrate test. And that'll give you a nitrate in parts per million. One of the important takeaways here is remember that nitrogen is almost always moving someplace. There's like 4 questions there, Emily. How did I do?
I think you got all of them.
Hey, can I
And
jump in real quick?
yes.
Thank you so much, Judson. So I asked that question. Hello, I live in Alaska, and we always take nitrogen every year for the test because we have a lot of fish scrap in our compost, which has a lot of NH3 and NO3, both of them. And yes, one is more leaching, and another has to be decomposed, and then nitrates bacterium has to work. But of course, we also have a permafrost and volcanic ash. So yes, that's why that was new to me to see that there's no nitrogen result in any soil test results. So I see the cultural difference. Thank you so much.
I thank you. I appreciate learning about that, and I would love to learn more about it. This is getting a bit philosophical, but again, this may be the lack of nitrogen on these tests might be a holdover from what is now probably an antiquated approach to soil management. And again, as nitrogen becomes more expensive and we recognize more and more its impact on the environment, particularly on water, I think it makes a lot of sense to include it in our tests.
All right. I have one more question, and if anybody, like, if I have somehow missed your question, feel free to enter it into the chat again. Every once in a while, I do miss something. The next question is, what do you recommend for caring for seedlings, for lettuce seedlings, before transplanting them into high tunnels?
Boy, that's a great question. In terms of maybe nutrients, I'm wondering if that's where that's coming from. I hope so.
We'll say nutrients.
Yeah. So my idea, and it's not an original idea to me, is that I would rather start with what I'm going to call a very lean transplant. So very lean, I'm talking about my nutrients. So let's say I'm growing those lettuce plugs in a 48 or a 50 cell tray, maybe higher, maybe 74. And any nutrients that they're going to get are either going to come from my watering or from the potting soil that I'm using. And lettuce is a fun crop in that we can transplant that pretty quickly. You might be able to transplant that at 4 weeks from seeding. Ideally, if I could get from week 0 to week 4 on that lettuce crop without fertilizing it, and then I put that into the ground, I find that that's a very robust seedling that's going to be able to then really get out there into the soil and get the nutrients that are in that soil, compared to something that's grown in a very nitrogen rich environment. So let's say if you're irrigating at like a 75 parts per million continual feed of nitrogen, you're going to have a beautiful seedling, nice dark green, rapid growth. But then that's going to go into the soil where it's going to have to access nitrogen that isn't always going to be in the same dilution or in that same nitrate form. And those plants can struggle and they tend to be very tender. So that's my advice. Grow on the nutrient side very lean, and the timing of that transplant is essential. That lean advice, you run into trouble if you don't transplant on time. And oftentimes I see growers hold on to trays of transplants 4 weeks, 6 weeks beyond the ideal transplant date, because that seedling has an arc of growth, and at some point it's going to be restricted by its root mass inside of those plugs, at which point it's now approaching a downward trend in terms of growth. And then it goes into the soil and it's got to recover again before it starts to move upward again on that arc of either fruit flower production or foliage production in the case of lettuce. So the timing of transplanting is as important as the nutrients.
And the person, I'm probably going to pronounce your name wrong, I'm so sorry, kinda says, thank you so much, and you answered perfectly.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you, kinda. So I'll keep moving until another question comes up, which I'm really enjoying here this evening. Just as a soil test is essential, a water test is essential as well. More so when we're growing indoors than outdoors. If we think about the amount of water that we're applying, I talked about earlier, say 3 liters or 3/4 of a gallon per plant per day. And I have, let's say, 500 plants in a single bay, 500 mature tomato or cucumber plants. That's somewhere around 350 gallons of water per day. And a gallon weighs 8 pounds. So I'm putting in several thousand pounds of water on a daily basis. And what's in that water is extremely important. It's more important than the fertilizers that we use. So, and we have no rain to buffer or dilute what is in that irrigation water. So again, test your irrigation water, absolute minimum for pH and alkalinity, which is a measurement of dissolved calcium. TDS and EC are measurements of salts. TDS stands for total dissolved solids. EC stands for electrical conductivity. And electrical conductivity is a shortcut to finding out your salt level, because salts conduct electricity through water. And then finally, your nutrient levels. This is very important for indoor growing, whether it's in a container or in the soil. You must water test. The labs that Emily and I were talking about here previous with soil, they all will handle water as well. So again, encourage you to test your irrigation water.
And if you're testing your irrigation water, I'm just going to throw it out there to also test for E. coli, especially if you are doing any overhead watering. It's very important for food safety, and we don't want poop on our plants.
Thank you. It sounds like you guys are doing some food safety work.
Yes, we are.
Yes, I could tell. I could tell. It's an important message. Sometimes I forget. So yes, test for those food safety things as well. I get a little obsessed with the other stuff. Now this is similar to our soil test. This is an example of a water test, and I'm not going to drag you through all of these, but a good lab is going to show you your result in this the second column here. And then what is your level of concern? So for example, here, this is a sample that a grower brought to me, and they were asking me, can I work with this water? Well, that's a tough question in this case. So my pH is 7.3, and that is a level of concern. Total alkalinity is measured at 525 milligrams per liter, or parts per million. That's a major problem because my level of concern is 100. Hardness level is close to 900 parts per million, and my upper threshold is 150. Electrical conductivity, so that's the EC. TDS, total dissolved solids, or another way to get to salts. Both of those are above where they need to be. And I'll jump down here to a couple of values at the bottom. Chlorides and sodium are also extremely high. So I hope you don't have a water test like this, because this is now a challenging situation for someone who wants to be in greenhouse growing. They really need to find an alternate water source. This water is too challenging to work with. And this water may be fine to drink, may be fine to wash your clothes or your dishes, but for greenhouse growing, it's just not suitable for plants. And in this case, we really needed to seek out another source of water. So get a water test if you can. It's essential for your plant health. And I know I'm throwing a lot of tests at you this evening, and this will be I hope it's the final one I talk about, which is foliar testing. And here my colleague is pulling a foliar sample from the tomato crop. And what she's doing is taking the most recently fully expanded leaf, so the leaf that has most recently reached its maximum size, and she's doing that just like a soil test, representative throughout the high tunnel, and then that goes to a lab. And then this allows us to see how good a job did we do interpreting our soil test and our water tests. This gives us an opportunity to make midstream corrections in our crop production. This is a very typical grower-built nutrient injection system. And if you recall the beginning of this presentation, I showed you that mess of 11 bags of fertilizer kind of haphazardly thrown by the greenhouse door. Now we have our nutrient injector here with a siphon that goes down into this blue bucket. And based on my soil test and my foliar test and my water test, there might be something in that blue bucket. Maybe it's a nitrogen fertilizer, maybe it's a potassium-based fertilizer. And then in this white bucket, I could have a different fertilizer, say calcium or something else. And then I can alternate that siphon between those two different fertilizer sources. I'll also highlight here this little gallon jug. That is sulfuric acid, and the grower is using that because he's taken a water test and knows that his calcium and pH are too high, so he needs to add some acid to that. Quick point that this is very dangerous. This can severely injure someone and shouldn't be left on the ground this way. You also need to work with a lab if you're going to inject an acid to know how much to use. To know how much acid to use, you have to have that water test, particularly pH and alkalinity. And we're talking about very minute amounts.
I've got another question in the chat.
Go for it.
Can you foliar test garlic? And what are we looking for with a foliar test for nutrients?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is yes, you can foliar test garlic. And my slides must be a little bit out of order because ideally I would have had a sample foliar test behind that. But we're looking at the major plant nutrients there. We're looking at nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, sulfur, and our micros, iron, zinc, boron, manganese, and probably a couple that I'm forgetting right now. That's what we're looking for in a foliar test. And most often what happens is we will catch a deficiency or maybe an excess in one of those, and then use that injection system that I showed you to try to correct that deficiency or excess. That's the way that works. And so the lab will send you back a report, and the actual, what we call sufficiency ranges, do vary by crop. And so it's important to let them know what crop you're working with.
Then there was a question of if UMass offers this service. I don't know if UMass offers foliar testing off the top of my head. I know they do disease testing. Do you know off the top of your head, Judson, if UMass Amherst Extension does foliar testing?
I don't know. They very well may. There's a very good chance they may. And if they don't, there are a lot of labs that do it, and it's like a soil test. It's probably around $15 to $20. I like Waters Ag Lab, which I mentioned earlier. Another very popular one is Waypoint. I think there's A&L Lab, J.R. Peters. There's a lot of labs that will do a foliar test for you.
And then what time in the spring would you foliar test garlic?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Let's think about it, because I don't consider myself a garlic expert.
Yeah, and she was also wondering if there was if there would be time to do anything that would like take effect if you're waiting for the foliage of garlic to come up.
Yes, and now we're getting into dangerous territory, because I don't consider myself an expert on garlic, and I think there is some debate over spring nitrogen applications in garlic. But I would say it is of value, that because some people will put out minor levels of nitrogen, as I understand it, on garlic, say 25 to 50 pounds of a spring application of nitrogen, and a foliar test could be of value there in determining how much you need to add.
Yeah. And Renee is now saying that fall is best for garlic for adding nitrogen, not spring.
Thank you. Yeah, I knew there was some controversy there, and yeah, I would say that soil test for garlic is really important in the fall. That's your best chance to get things down.
And I have two more questions. One is, what is an alternative that can be used for acid? And then I will read through the other question and then make it easy, make it a little shorter, or
Thank
let
you.
you answer that question first, because it's a longer question.
Thank you. Yeah, so I went very quickly through what could be its own webinar in and of itself, which is the use of acids in irrigation water. And so I mentioned sulfuric acid. Sulfuric acid is the most common acid used in greenhouse production, and generally the most economical in terms of the cost of the product and how effective it is at dropping pH. It's generally the acid of choice. There are two other conventional sources of acid. There's phosphoric acid and nitric acid. Those are used much, much less commonly. One advantage with phosphoric acid is for container growers of, say, ornamentals. You are getting a little boost in your phosphorus if you use phosphoric acid. The sulfuric acid is the most common. An alternative to that for our certified organic growers is citric acid. And so citric acid, you'd want to check with your certifier if you are indeed certified. But generally a food grade citric acid is acceptable in organic production and is close to the same level of efficacy as sulfuric acid in terms of dropping pH. However, it is a little more expensive. So sulfuric acid or citric acid, those are my top two choices.
Excellent. Then, in regards to the lettuce again, some of their plants are bolting before they reach their true growing potential, and they have a few showing calcium deficiency. Does foliar application of calcium assist with this? And should they add more watering cycles to help with the bolting?
Great question. So I'm not a big fan of foliar applications of calcium or almost any nutrient for that matter. I do think it can help in emergency situations. But I would look for more regular watering. First, get your soil test and figure out how many ppm or how many pounds per acre calcium do I have in the soil. And then is your pH somewhere between 6 and 6.5, where you're going to have maximum uptake of calcium. Those things need to be in place first. Figure out your soil level, correct it up to somewhere probably between 2 to 4,000 pounds per acre of calcium, and correct your pH so that it's in the low sixes. And then I would look at water delivery. How uniform can I make my water? Not that I want to saturate the soil, but I want it to be evenly moist. Something farmers have often said to me is they want a consistency like a nice chocolate cake. You don't want it so wet that when you squeeze the soil, water comes out, and you don't want it so dry that when you pick it up, it falls apart in your hand, somewhere in between those. And then the final thing to think about with calcium deficiency in lettuce is, are there other factors that are driving the growth rate of the lettuce too quickly that calcium is not reaching
Oh,
the
yeah.
latest growing leaf, the latest growing tissue? So the newest tissue is where your calcium deficiency occurs. And there's a couple things that can have you pushing tissue growth faster than calcium uptake. One of those could be heat. Another could be excess light. And another could be excess wind, excess air movement. So think about all of those things. Could we apply a minor amount of shade to the situation? A very low percentage of shade? Could we apply some overhead irrigation to reduce transpiration, reduce the amount of water loss that's occurring? And then finally, is there a way to reduce any wind stress that the plant may be having?
All right, then this person, their soil pH is 5.5, and they would also like to know if they can purchase foliar or soil test kits online.
You can buy soil tests online. I don't have a lot of confidence in them. I would prefer a lab test, but you can buy them online, particularly pH meters. A foliar test, no, not that I know of. There are sensors now that will give you leaf nitrate levels, and I believe those are fairly accurate, but they will not give you phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, calcium, sulfur, all those other things that are very important. So sorry to repeat myself, but I really depend on labs to give me those results. They're just so much more economical and accurate.
All right, I've got another long question.
Okay.
So this farmer, they irrigate with well water with a very high pH of 7.8. They haven't had any issues in their tunnel so far after 2 years of growing.
Mhm.
They also just did 2 soil tests, one before and after 10 inches of overhead irrigation. Somehow the soil pH decreased from 6.3 to 6.0. The soil was very high in sulfur, and that level also decreased dramatically along with the sodium. So they're wondering if there's a connection there, or if there's any possible explanation for this, or if you have any concerns with using high pH water in general.
Great questions. Everything is connected. We don't always understand how. So sulfur is an interesting nutrient in that oftentimes plants need sulfur, right? As a nutrient in and of itself, but oftentimes we use sulfur for its effect on soil pH in that it lowers it. And sulfur, like nitrogen, depends on biological processes to turn into an active state, really, of sulfuric acid that can then disassociate calcium and lower the pH. So that takes time, and it takes moisture, and it takes temperature. So generally we recommend fall applications of sulfur so that we have several months for it to become activated in the soil. Let's see, where was I going with that? So anyway, so some of the differences in pH and sulfur levels there may correspond to the sulfur that was in the soil becoming activated by microbes and then lowering pH over time. That takes time. And I think the final part of that question was, do I have a problem with high pH water? I guess I do, particularly indoors, because we don't have any rain. That high pH water will lead to high pH soils, and then high pH soils lead to nutrient deficiencies in the plant. Now, it sounds like the person who asked that question is on top of this if they were creating a 10-inch rain event. And water that is problematic, it's a little bit counterintuitive, but it's a good idea to use a lot of it versus a little bit of it. So if you have a water pH of 7.8, over time, your soil pH is going to go up to 7.8, and it'll actually probably continue to increase above that if you're just using a minor amount of water or as little water as possible. And a lot of that water is evaporated out of the soil profile, leaving behind trace amounts of calcium, which then contribute to higher and higher pH. Whereas if you leach that soil profile very thoroughly with a 7.8 water, you're going to reset the soil pH to 7.8 versus in the other situation, it might climb up to 8. So Emily, how are we doing? Go ahead.
There's one more question.
Yeah.
We have about 20 minutes left of the webinar. How are you doing on slides right now?
Oh, I think I probably got about a 10th of the way through the presentation. I'd much rather answer questions than again do slides, but I do have. Let's take a look. I was going to talk. I mean, the message I really wanted to give here tonight, what Tufts asked me to speak about was enhancing soil health, and I'll just share that the message I wanted to give is that cover crops allow us to do that. So I'm just going to share a couple images of how we do this. We saturate our soil overhead with this overhead irrigation. And then as soon as we can, we like to seed a cover crop. And that cover crop may be a grain, it may be a legume, depending on what we're trying to achieve. And then we are going to terminate that in the spring. Here you can see we're doing a chisel plow on I think this is a rye crop indoors. And in short, just not to take up too much more time here, what we see when we do this is better nutrient cycling. We see better nitrogen. Go ahead, Emily.
To interject really quick, there is somebody who is really interested in hearing about this in the comments, and yes. The person who had a question would like to keep going and hear more of your presentation. So okay. If you want, we can kind of go through these slides, and then maybe we'll just go through them a little bit faster than usual, yes. And then we'll save the rest of the questions till the end. And if other people have more questions, we have emails because of the wonderful internet.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
How's that sound to everyone?
That sounds great. And I apologize if I've gone on too long at any point here, folks.
Oh no, I think the answers are great. I'm glad that you've got good answers for everything. I feel like I'm learning a lot from the questions people are asking too.
Well, great. And bear in mind, I'm one person. Take what you heard here this evening, first and foremost, balance it with your own experience and your own working knowledge and those of other people you trust as well. So we grow that cover crop in winter time, and generally we're trying to seed that where I am here in New York, probably as early as we can in October. And right now we're using a grain such as triticale, barley, or rye in combination with something called winter peas. Sometimes they're called Austrian peas. But both of those species will germinate in cold temperatures, which is really what we need. The earlier I go on my seeding date, the more I can lean on a legume, such as those peas, which fixes nitrogen from the atmosphere and puts it into the soil in an organic form. The later in the season I go with my establishment, I'm going to favor more a grain, which germinates better in colder soils than most legumes, and can scavenge excess nitrogen in the soil and put it into the vegetative form, which we then incorporate, that you see here. The question of seeding date is going to depend on each grower. And I find that the grower is generally looking at how much revenue is this space generating for me in the fall, whether that's from a cut flower operation or a tomato or a cucumber or greens. And that oftentimes decides the seeding date, I find. So Emily asked at the beginning of this, does row cover, those white blankets that we are using, actually affect our cover crop? And so I'll just highlight here our triticale with cover, and we had 2 high tunnels in this trial. One terminated on March, one terminated in April. Compared to without cover, it's double, really. So we have 82 pounds when we had cover on the early terminated tunnel compared to 47 pounds. 191 pounds of nitrogen compared to 75. That's more than twice the amount of nitrogen, simply using that row cover that we generally have on farm for pest management and disease management anyway. Again, if we are able to get in there in September, we stand a better chance of having a beautiful legume crop like this with our Austrian peas. If we do get a very lush crop of peas like that, they are very sensitive to winter killing. And in some ways that can be a good thing, and that it's going to reduce the amount of tillage that we have to do in the spring. And trying to think what I should include and what I should skip. So I just want people to be creative with how they approach the situation. It is not a one-size-fits-all attitude. So if we look at using a high tunnel for a rotation between greens and tomatoes on a calendar basis, it could look something like this, where the tomatoes are occupying that space from mid-April to mid-October, and then I have greens that are going to have to be translated or transplanted as soon as the tomatoes come out, and they're going to be in there till March. This gives me a very good revenue potential out of that space, but is not contributing to the soil in any way. What if I did that same rotation, but instead of growing greens, I put cover crops in that same space? I reduce my revenue potential considerably, but I'm improving the physical, biological, and chemical status of my soil with that cover crop. And again, with the increasing price of fertilizers, this is of more and more value. We could do the same thing with cucumbers, which are a much shorter crop than tomatoes. And here you can see I get a cucumber crop in mid-June, take that to September, and then I go with my greens. And if I terminate those in mid-March, I could actually cheat in a little cover crop here before I start again with that. Or I could grow the cover crop as soon as the cucumbers come out, beginning on October 1st, and terminate those in late March. And because greens can grow well in a cool climate, I could have those in there in the months of April, May, and June. And the final slide that I'll share here this evening is one I find very encouraging, which is our current work. We're looking at mixtures of cover crop. So not just a grain, not just a legume, but a mixture of multiple grains, multiple legumes, and possibly what we call brassica, such as turnips or radishes. And having grown those in separate plots inside of the high tunnel, we then collect our foliar test. Remember that picture of the woman pulling tomato leaves, and look at here our top three nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. And we can see where we had a mixed cover crop, we have in this blue bar higher levels of nitrogen. And that makes sense. We've got more legumes fixing more nitrogen and the grains scavenging nitrogen. But the value that really surprised us, encouraged us, is potassium. And so potassium is not fixed from the atmosphere. It is either there in the soil on its own or we add it. But we saw that tomatoes had better uptake of potassium where we had a mixed cover crop. And I can only conclude that our cover crop is contributing to the microbial status of the soil such that we're finding these nutrients in a more available form to the plant. So that was really encouraging to see both nitrogen and potassium increased where we're growing cover crops. And with that, this is my final slide. I'm just going to say thank you to all of you for your outstanding participation this evening from all over the hemisphere. It's an honor to be with you, and I want to thank Tufts and Emily for her outstanding job of moderating all of those wonderful questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Judson. And thank you for giving us such a wonderful talk on soils and soil health. We still have time for a couple of questions. I'm going to start off with just one question, which I wrote down. So what would your top three tips be for having healthy soils and high tunnels?
Great question. So first is soil test. Next is cover crop. And number three is create a leaching event, either through removal of plastic or doing one with overhead sprinkling like I showed. Those would be my top three.
And then what would you say the biggest or most common mistake you see farmers make in their tunnel soils?
The most common one is for people who use conventional fertilizers, it is the over application of a uniform analysis. So the classic one is a triple 20, 20% nitrogen, 20% phosphorus, 20% potassium. And so the plant doesn't need the nutrients in that ratio, and the soil doesn't need the nutrients in that ratio. And that works for about 1 year, 2 year. By year three, that approach runs into problems. The other on the organic side of this, it is the over application of compost, and too much compost generally drives our pH too high.
Then I've got a couple of questions popping up in the chat, and one other question, just because I know I've tried to learn soils and soil sciences many times, and for some reason it just never sticks for me. So if you are somebody like me, who can interpret the results that you get from soil tests or give you some recommendations on what to apply?
Yeah, so I would encourage people to look to their extension system, your local extension agents. If you're in the States, those people, that's their job, is to help you interpret a soil test and explain it in a way that you understand. Now, tonight we're limited by technology and time, and probably not everything I said made sense to everyone, but sit down with one of those extension educators and don't get up until you understand thoroughly the results of your soil test.
Awesome. Then we have two questions in the chat. Can cover crop rotation actually replace the need for supplemental fertilizers and nutrient applications?
That's an outstanding question. And the quick answer is probably no. But I believe it can greatly reduce the need for fertilizers. Certain things we do need to add. Calcium might be one of those. And if you look at that mature tomato crop, I might be pulling out 500 pounds of calcium out of that soil on an annual basis. And if my irrigation water doesn't naturally have calcium in it, I would need to add that. So the answer to the question is no. And the only way to know for sure is to soil test.
Okay. Oh,
I lost Emily.
Emily.
I think it said someone named Francois became the host.
Hi there. Yeah. I'm one of the interns at New Entry.
Oh, okay.
So I can jump in. So one of the next questions that we see is for the Northeast region, are there any crops that you shouldn't grow or aren't worth growing in high tunnels, and why might that be?
Oh, wow. I'm sorry, is it cover crops or just crops?
It was just crops. They didn't specify, but Edith, if you want
Just
to,
wow.
Oh, just crops in general.
Yeah, well,
Just
there's
cover
lots of them. Sweet corn, I wouldn't grow sweet corn inside. It's probably easier to say what should be grown inside. And again, for me,
Yeah.
it's things that take advantage of that vertical space. That's tomatoes, that's cucumbers, cut flowers. I don't work with cut flowers myself, but boy, cut flowers do fantastic indoors. And then our whole winter green sweet, and I mentioned ginger, peppers, sprawling things, pumpkins, zucchinis, winter squash, all of those I would not consider.
Mm-hmm. And let's see, we have time for some more questions, I think. Another question is, how often are you watering cover crops over the winter?
Oh, yes. It's surprisingly seldom. And so once we water that crop in that I showed that overhead watering, in that case, it was early October. We will probably not water again until late February. And the reason being, I didn't get into this, but at these latitudes where we are, there's not a lot of plant growth that goes on between late November and late February. Once you get to late February, the day length tips to the point where you have plant growth again. And then you can start watering again. So very little, if at all, in the months of November, December, and January.
Great. Let's see which one was next. Oh, we have a question about movable tunnels and why more growers maybe won't use movable tunnels that are either on tracks or use like some sort of pivot system. Renee says that it seems like a good solution for salt buildup, etc. Is the issue that the NRCS tunnel grants don't cover tracks. I don't know if you know of that.
It's a very good question and very perceptive in that if you had a movable tunnel, my whole talk goes out the window because you can move to a fresh piece of soil on a yearly basis. And it does make sense if you can make the tunnel make sense. So my experience is that I think every grower I've worked with who installed a movable tunnel eventually fixed that tunnel to one spot because it's more susceptible to wind damage when it's on those tracks. Yeah. I don't mean to discard the idea, but it still seems like it's a challenge for people to do that over the long term.
Emily, do you know anything about funding for those and if it's different?
So funding for high tunnels through NRCS equip, it's kind of like a flat rate per square foot that you get paid. And if it usually will cover the cost of a greenhouse put up by like a normal person, not normal person, but like a kind of standard organization. You can find people who will install them for cheaper, and then you have money left for things like automatic roll-up sides, tracks if you wanted to do a greenhouse on tracks or things like that. I feel like a lot of the people that I see with extra money are going for the automatic roll-up sides because nobody lives where their farm is anymore, because they are leasing land. So they are more interested in those automations versus moving the tunnel around when they're going to take the plastic off in 3 or 4 years and possibly let the water come in just like from the winter.
Yeah, nice. I think we'll just keep going because we have a little bit more time if that's okay with you, Judson.
Yep.
A few more questions. Sweet.
Sure.
One question is, someone heard of a woman doing peaches in a high tunnel in a northern state, and they're asking what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, great. I don't know a lot about that. I think University of Michigan has done some great work with those with perennial crops, tree fruit and grapes as well. So I would point people there. I do think there's probably some issues around. I probably shouldn't say much about it because I'm not an expert in the area, but one of the issues is the trees need to be cold. Peaches, not too cold, but they do need a winter time. And apples and our stone fruit, all of those crops need chilling hours. And if they're in a high tunnel that gets warm, let's say it gets 60 degrees in January, you run into dormancy issues and winter hardiness on some of those. But check out what Michigan has done.
That's great. Anne is asking, they have one small high tunnel, which is about 800 square feet. And they're wondering how to handle crop rotation or how you would advise them handling crop rotation.
That's great. This is where that pencil and pad come in. The size in this case, I don't think really matters. It really matters on what are the needs of that farm. And so do you need to produce spinach for a winter farmer's market or a winter CSA? And in that case, is the summertime a cover cropping opportunity for you? And let's say you have greens in there from September until June, and now you can grow a real fun cover crop like say buckwheat in the summertime, and then take that out and go with your greens crop. Or is it the opposite? You live in an area where there's a lot of tomato disease and you need to grow inside to avoid endless sprays. And in that case, it would be tomatoes or cucumbers, April, depending on where you live, till October, and then a cover crop. Those are quick suggestions on it, but in the end, it depends on the market demand for those growers and when is there an opportunity to improve soil health.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. And I think maybe we'll do one last question, which is, does excessive compost applications create problems other than just adjusting the pH?
That's a good question. The other common problem is pH, and calcium is very tied to pH. It's not the same, but it is very related. Those are the most common problems caused by high compost applications. We haven't completed this research yet, but I would venture a guess that a soil that is too high in organic matter is more susceptible to drying out and becoming very cold. And my position is that those soils, even though they have great organic matter, may not have great microbial life because they're so high in organic matter, they go through these wet, dry, hot, cold fluctuations. And what else was I going to say with that? Oh, at very high organic matters, you also reduce your aggregate stability. And so you could get into drought stress issues as well in very high organic matters.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And I'll let Emily close it out.
Thank you. Thanks
for
for jumping in.
taking over, Jasper. My laptop battery decided to die very suddenly after telling me that it was low. It was just like, oh, I'm low. Now I'm dead. So thank you for taking over. And thank you again so much, Judson, for giving us this great talk on soil health in high tunnels. And everyone, please remember to take your survey after the workshop. It's very, very quick, I promise. And I think that's all I've got. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a good
Thank you
night,
so
everyone.
much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank y'all.
Thanks. Thank you.